Several years ago on a church trip up to Pennsylvania, my group and I may or may not have stayed in a haunted church. And two of us may or may not have been controlled by a spirit. Let's discuss the setting. There were several of us, probably around 11, most around the age of 16 or 17. Every year for the past 8 or 9 years, we drive from Oklahoma up to Pennsylvania to a church camp near Bedford. This was year 3, and we had decided to take an extra 2 or 3 days to stop at Gettysburg and explore around there. An old youth, who was now an adult and married, of our church pastor arranged for us to stay a night at her church near Gettysburg so we wouldn't have to pay out the ears for yet another overpriced gross motel. This happened to be the first church our pastor had ever served at. He had told us stories leading up to our trip. This church was very old, built around the Civil War times. There was a graveyard surrounding it, and the graves to the east were so old that you could no longer read what was once engraved. These were likely from the Civil War itself. This church had a slave gallery where my church pastor reported hearing footsteps and floorboards creaking, swearing that, "I know what a settling house sounds like, and that was not it." This church had a house where the pastor and his or her family could live in just about 500 feet from the church. My pastor reported that one night when he was going to walk from the house to the church to write his sermon in the sanctuary, he stepped outside. Suddenly, this large bank of fog rolled across the oldest graves, blocking the way from his house to the church. With the eerie feeling hovering in the air, he decided to write his sermon the next night. Now, with the backstory of that out of the way, let's get on to the details of our short stay there. I am a female, now 22 years old. Most of the other people in the story are guys. All these guys I graduated high school with, and they were all my best friends, one being my twin brother, Steven. The others are Nick, Michael, Ian, Antonio, and Tanner. A couple of other girls were Lyrica and Ellen. The other folks who were there were all downstairs away from anywhere that claimed to have high activity. All those listed besides Steven and Ellen decided to sleep in the sanctuary, the most haunted location of the church. Now, I use the terms such as haunted and activity lightly, because I tend to be a skeptic. I suppose you could say I'm on the fence about it all, and believe that there are reasonable expectations for all of these things. Nevertheless, all these events in sequence are hard to stamp coincidence on. When we first got there, it was light out, and we enjoyed talking in the beautiful forest surrounding the church and graveyard. There was a playground just to the north of the church, off from the cemetery, just about 100 feet from the pastor's house. We unloaded our overnight bags and went inside for dinner and to start setting up where we would sleep. 3 or 4 folks decided to sleep downstairs in the basement where the little kids' classroom and Sunday school rooms were. 3 people, Ellen, Ian, and the pastor, decided to sleep in the fellowship hall just across the hall from the sanctuary. Anthony decided to sleep in the slave gallery. He had decided that since he was the only black guy there, he wanted to be ironic and make a statement. Tanner was going to sleep up there with him, but got scared as night fell. Tanner, who is practically my little brother, was only 14 or 15 at the time of this event. He was the second youngest, with Lyrica being around 13 or 14. Let me try to describe how the entryway, fellowship hall, and sanctuary were set up. There was the main side door. This door was the only source of light outside after dark, beside a few distant street lamps. There was a small floodlight right above the door. After you stepped into the door, if you looked to your right, there was a fellowship hall where we ate our meals and where a few folks slept. Right in front were the stairs to go to the children's rooms, and to the left was the sanctuary. This doorway to the sanctuary was the back right corner where you stood at the podium and faced the pews. The sanctuary was large, with I believe 2 sets of stairs on either side leading up to the slave gallery. Along the walls there were windows every few feet, probably 4 or 5 windows per wall, besides the front wall where the pulpit was. The pews were aligned in 3 sections with several rows each. There was a path directed from the back door that we used to the pulpit. As night fell, everyone was hyped about ghosts and the possibility of being spooked. I wasn't much of a fan of being scared. I am jumpy and easily spooked to begin with, even when I let logic lead my thoughts. My closest friends, Nick, Michael, Steven, and Tanner, had all been joking about how they were going to scare everyone once we were all asleep. They said how they will pretend to be ghosts and scare us all. Of course, I didn't believe them. I figured they were just being dumb teenage boys bluffing. After it was dark, many of us decided to go explore the cemetery and see what we could find on the graves. Perhaps we would see an apparition. We kind of played hide and seek, but mostly just used that to sneak around and scare each other. At one point, my brother came out with his white mask on, no shirt, and his bedsheet. While us hooligans were playing around, laughing and running, I noticed Nick and Lyrica were simply standing, staring at the playground. I went over to see what they were looking at, and slowly the rest of the gang followed. "What are y'all doing?" I asked them. "Watching those ghost children play," Nick responded. I looked at him. I was trying to figure out if he was joking or not. He had this habit of being sarcastic and playing pranks. I went to look at his face and he was completely nonchalant and relaxed. No expression of sarcasm or trying to hide a smile. And he was very bad at hiding a smile. He just looked at the playground as if he was watching some squirrels playing in the snow, or watching a light rain fall to the earth, splashing in the puddles forming outside. I looked at Lyrica and said, "No, seriously, what are y'all looking at?" She said the same thing and added, "They're just playing like normal kids would." I couldn't see anything. I strained my eyes, but there was nothing besides the effect my eyes make when trying to make sense of the blackness. It was so dark that night, I could hardly see the outline of the playground itself. Nick tried to show me where they were and what they were doing, but I couldn't see them. They were the only two that could see anything. Perhaps it was just their eyes playing tricks, or they both saw the same thing. There's no way to tell at this point. I cannot recall if they reported the kids doing the same thing at the same time or not, and even then they could have been playing a prank on us. They seemed genuine though, and I knew Nick like I knew the back of my hand, and I could not see or sense any mischief in his actions. The rest of us who couldn't make out any playing figures went back to goofing around like teenage children. Later, Nick also claimed to see a woman sitting at a bench marking a gravesite. I took a photo of this location in hopes of catching something, but nothing came up. After some time, we all decided it was late and best to go inside. We had a big day in the morning. Now, how we slept is important to this story. Antonio had fallen asleep long before the rest of us. His snores were echoing from the slave gallery above. As mentioned earlier, Tanner had decided to sleep down with the rest of us out of fear. Being the scaredy cat I am, I had decided to sleep in the most secure-seeming location, right behind the pulpit. The pulpit was raised on a small stage with about 3 steps leading up to it. It was a traditional-looking pulpit, but not giant. A modest size, large enough for someone of a 5'1" stature to sleep comfortably behind it without seeing past it. I slept on the floor. Nick slept on the couch right next to me. I suppose it was more of a cushioned bench with a back. I felt safe sleeping between the pulpit and my best friend. Little Tanner slept on the floor in front of the pulpit. Michael was to the left of us near where the band would play. Lyrica was in the walkway right in front of the door. I suppose she wanted to sleep in the sanctuary, but also not too close to the scary stuff and where the light was on her from the porch light. I have always had trouble falling asleep. It takes me forever, and I also wake up to the slightest thing. This is where the story gets really interesting. Everyone had fallen asleep in just a matter of a few minutes. As fun as this trip up north always is, it is an exhausting one. Nick was snoring softly, and I was nearly drifting off as well. Slowly, I heard someone get up and walk up the pulpit steps. I gave it no mind. I figured it was Tanner and he was just looking for his phone or something. I don't remember my exact thought, Suddenly I start hearing Nick screaming, which woke up Michael, and with his booming voice he yelled, "What the hell is going on?" I jumped up to see Tanner, eyes closed, pulling on Nick's hair as if he was pulling a carrot out of the ground. Michael described it as Tanner looking as though he was trying to scalp Nick. "Tanner, what are you doing?" I yelled, and Tanner opened his eyes, looked at Nick, who was still screaming, somehow still asleep, and let go. He clasped his hands over his mouth and stuttered, "Oh my God, I'm so sorry. I don't know why I did that. I'm so sorry, guys. I'm sorry." And he turned and walked back to his sleeping bag. I looked at Michael, and then at Nick, who seemed fine. Michael, attempting to gain control of the situation, said, "Okay, just go back to sleep, everyone, and stop fooling around." Within minutes, everyone was back to sleep, besides me, of course. After about 30 minutes, Nick got up and stepped over me. I assumed he was heading off to the restroom and would be back momentarily. I fell asleep, finally, shortly after that. I'm not sure how much longer it was after this, but I woke up to a loud bang. I sprung my eyes open and laid there for half a second as my heart crawled back into my chest. Then I was angry. I grabbed my phone and turned on the flashlight. Those fucking boys. I swear to God I'm going to murder them. Pulling shit like this. I'm gonna... I had turned my flashlight on, stood up on my knees to look just barely over the pulpit, and flung the light towards where Michael was sleeping, expecting to see something there. Unfortunately for me, he was fast asleep in a lump. I shined the light to where Tanner was, and he was curled up in a ball inside his sleeping bag. I slowly turned my light off and sunk behind the pulpit again. I held my breath to see if I could hear Antonio snoring. To my dismay, I could. I just sat there, leaning over on my hands and knees, wondering what in the world I had just heard. I thought, maybe I had just dreamed it. That happens sometimes. But suddenly I heard the loud bang again, and again. It sounded like it was starting behind me, and it worked its way around the sanctuary towards the left until it got to the back. I poked my head above the podium to see if I could see anything. From my blurry vision to the darkness, there was nothing. It sounded like someone was pounding on the windows, one at a time, but was moving too fast for it to be normal. The pounding came one right after the other, moving from one window to the next. A single bang per window. This is the part I have no explanation for. I was surprised to see no one else had woken up. As I scanned the sanctuary walls and windows, I looked towards the right and saw a figure standing at the door, under the floodlight from one of the sanctuary windows. With my blurry eyes, I thought, that looks like Nick? Without his shirt on? I grabbed my glasses and looked again. Sure enough, it was Nick, shirtless, standing in the chilly night air. Walked outside. I jumped up, turned into my mama bear mode, and sped down the aisle to the door. I looked down at Lyrica, who had just woken up. She was huddled in her sleeping bag, her face barely poking out, peering at me. I got to the door, opened it, and started fussing. "Nicholas, what are you doing out there? Where is your shirt?" "I don't know. I just woke up outside, standing in the cemetery where the oldest graves are," he replied, voice quiet and shaking. "Get in and go back to sleep," I demanded. We went back to our spots and eventually fell back to sleep. When recounting the event to others, Ellen, asleep in the fellowship hall across from the sanctuary, said she was awake and saw the shadow of someone standing at the door. She was terrified and heard someone coming. Me. I can't recall if she had heard the banging too, or if Lyrica did. All I know is what I have reported, and how odd it was that no one else seemed to have woken up by the incidences. The most interesting part to me was how the banging led away from where Nick was standing, so it seemed hard to believe that it was him banging. Although that is entirely possible. I could have been perceiving the sounds coming from the wrong location. although I don't think Nick would have hit the door or windows hard enough that I feared they would break. The next morning, Nick's shirt was laying in the middle of the aisle towards the door. Our most logical speculation is that he got hot, since the church has no air conditioning, took off his shirt and walked outside to cool off. He had a reputation of sleepwalking when he was a little kid, so this too can be a plausible explanation. But what about Tanner? He had never experienced sleepwalking before in his life. And the apparent ghost children? Now, I could be the fool of an elaborate joke by my guys, but I would hope more than 5 years later they would have told me it was a joke, instead of excitedly going into the details of the event with me whenever I tell it. It's hard to say. The skeptic in me can explain most of this phenomenon, but the spiritual person in me has to wonder if these events were actually the result of some ghost encounters or possessions. Let me start off by saying this isn't a particularly scary story, but it is disturbing, and all these years later it still gives me and my friends the creeps. To this day, we still cannot explain what happened. I went to high school in Denver, Colorado way back in the late 1970s. My friends and I enjoyed getting together on weekends and playing war games. By this I mean we would gear up with heavy camouflage clothing, wear fencing masks, and shoot each other with BB rifles. Much like modern-day paintball warriors. We had enough guys to usually make 2 teams of 5 to 6 people, and always had a great time whenever we got together. Our favorite spot to meet was near Sedalia, Colorado. Sedalia is about an hour south of Denver. One of the guys knew a property owner there that allowed us to use his large property of meadows, rock formations, and small canyon to do our thing. One late spring day, my friend Stan and I drove down to the area west of Sedalia to scout out another spot for our make-believe battles. We were driving around exploring the forests, acreages, and hills when we came upon an apparently old jeep trail heading off into what we believed to be the National Forest land. Stan and I headed up the trail in his old Dodge 4-wheel truck, and we passed several areas we thought would suit our needs nicely. We decided to go further up the trail, thinking the further we went, the less likely we would come across an irate landowner, hikers, or outdoorsmen. We followed the remnants of the road for almost an hour, enjoying the scenery and the mountain views before we stopped at a promising spot, got out and hiked around a bit. We must have hiked for about an hour when we found an awesome spot that was everything we needed. Plenty of trees for cover, rock formations, a small canyon that was easily accessible by foot, and a small brook running through. Considering our job well done, Stan and I hiked back to the truck. The day was clear and warm, with the temperatures in the 70s, so needless to say, when we arrived at the truck we were a bit worn out. It was about 2:30 in the afternoon as we drove back down the trail. We decided to find a shaded spot to pull over and have a bite to eat, and about 15 minutes later Stan pulled into a clearing and we did just that. Now let me describe this clearing, as this is important. Picture a dirt road with a lot of trees standing densely along each side. The spot we pulled into had a break in the trees that I would say was maybe 25 feet wide, and went back about 100 feet deep. About 40 feet in, there was a clearing that allowed Stan to turn the truck around and face back towards the road. It was here that we parked. This clearing was a rough circle that was maybe 15 feet in circumference, with no rocks or felled trees or limbs in it. It was completely flat. This is where things got weird. I exited the truck and ducked behind a tree to relieve myself, and Stan stayed in the truck, unwrapping his sandwich. As I wandered back to the truck, I was able to take a better look at the clearing we were in. The patch of ground Stan had parked on was devoid of anything growing. Sure, there were trees around us, but the ground was completely barren of anything but dirt. I mean, nothing was growing in this patch. But there was mountain grasses and the like growing near the trees and into the forest. As I stood there, I noticed everything was quiet. No sounds of birds, insects, nothing. Just a cloying silence. I remember getting a chill as I looked around and suddenly was sure that I was being watched. I scanned the surrounding trees but didn't see or hear anything. I quickly walked back to the truck, brushing it off as an overactive imagination. When I got in the truck, Stan was munching his sandwich and looking around. I didn't say anything as I sat there, unwrapping my sandwich and quietly eating it as I looked around too. Both Stan and I ate quietly, not saying a thing. There was a tenseness in the air, and I believe neither of us wanted to say a thing about it for fear of the usual teasing and insults we would give each other at showing the slightest sign of weakness. Something teenage boys do the world over. As we sat there in the truck, windows down, listening to the overwhelming silence around us, there was a sudden chill in the air. I'm not talking about a temperature drop of a few degrees. I'm talking about a drop in temperature drastic enough that we could see our breath begin condensing in front of us. I'm talking about a temperature drop of at least 30+ degrees. The feeling of tenseness grew even more pronounced, and I looked over at Stan, wanting to see if he sensed it too. The look on his face confirmed it. Stan was beginning to panic, as was I. Without saying a word, Stan put his sandwich down, started the truck and put it into gear and went to drive out of there. We both knew something wasn't right. As soon as Stan began to pull forward, the truck suddenly stopped as if it was caught on something. He rocked the truck forward and backwards several times trying to free us, but we seemed to be stuck on something. I knew I didn't want to get out of the truck to see what was holding us back. I just wanted to get the hell out of there because I was convinced we were in serious trouble. I was scared to death and I had no idea of what. I yelled at Stan to put the truck in 4-wheel drive, and he yelled back that it was in 4-wheel drive. Stan gunned the truck again, and suddenly we were free. The truck lurched forward and I heard a screeching metallic sound as Stan made it back onto the road, and we hauled ass back down the mountain. The farther down the road we got, the calmer we became. The feeling of dread lessened with each passing minute. By the time we got back to the country road, we were laughing the whole thing off. I was sure the temperature drop was some kind of weather phenomena, and we overreacted. I teased Stan about his driving skills and told him maybe we wouldn't get hung up on a branch or a rock if he knew how to drive. The trip back to Denver was uneventful. A week had passed and I had all but forgotten about this incident when Stan called me and asked me if I could come over to his house. He sounded pretty upset, so I drove right over. When I got there, his truck was on ramps in his parents' driveway and he was standing beside it. Stan was obviously shook up and looking pale. I walked up and asked him what was up. Stan told me he was changing the oil in his truck and found something he wanted me to see. I shrugged and crawled underneath to take a look. What I saw freaks me out to this day. At first glance, everything looked normal, until Stan asked me to look at the front axle. I saw where the axle had some scratching and what appeared to be minor denting on the axle tubing. This area was somewhat cleaner than the rest of the axle and looked like the dirt and grime had been disturbed. There were some scrape marks and dents near the top of the axle tube as well. Stan told me to look at the oil pan, and when I did, it looked like there were gouges in it, 4 to be exact, with a 5th small gouge on the side. The gouging was enough to make the metal curl into little spirals that went towards the back part of the pan. Basically like little curls of metal that were deep enough into the pan to show themselves, but not deep enough to puncture the pan itself. As I lay there trying to take this whole thing in, naturally I told him it was probably from tree branches or something. Stan looked down at me and shook his head back and forth and told me to look again. This time holding my fingers up as if I were scratching the pan or gripping the axle. When I held my fingers to the gouges in the pan, I suddenly saw what Stan was talking about, and the whole incident the week before flooded back and the creepiness returned. When I splayed my fingers out to the widest I could, they about perfectly matched with the 5 gouges in the pan and the little curls of metals at the end of the gouges. When I gripped the axle with my hand, the scratches and slight indentations at the top of the axle almost matched identically to where my fingers would be if I were gripping it. Before anyone says it, Stan was not a practical joker, and the look on his face was enough to tell me that this wasn't a setup. He was scared. I saw Stan a few years back and brought this event up again. I was curious to see if he thought about it as often as I do. He remains convinced that we stumbled upon something that can't be logically explained. Needless to say, we never went back up there for our war games. I keep trying to come up with a reasonable explanation for this, but I can't. All these years later, and all I think about is seeing nothing on the ground but dirt in that clearing we pulled into. I ask myself why that round patch of ground was completely void of vegetation when the rest of the forest surrounding it teemed with life. Then I ask what could have been strong enough to stop a 4.5-ton four-wheel drive truck in its tracks and hold it there momentarily. And if it was a hand or hands, as I believe it was, what the heck were those hands attached to? Anyhow, that's my story, and I hope you enjoyed it. I appreciate you checking out this video, and if you would like to help support the channel, I recommend becoming a patron. You can find a link in the description, or even becoming a channel member. You get some cool perks from both of those options, and it really does help the channel out a lot. A lot. I hope everybody is having a great weekend, and I hope you enjoyed these stories. If you have a story you would like to submit, make sure you email it to urmaker6260@gmail.com, and I will catch you in the next video. Bye. I'm an ocean fisherman and diver. It's something I've done for many years. Being out in the ocean sometime when fishing for salmon can get kind of boring, so I bought myself a little RC boat to cruise around while I'm bored. It's a cool little Coast Guard boat, and it's got a little life floaty on it, and it's made to scale. It's pretty cool. Well, one weekend I decided to bring my friend with me. We get out to the fishing area and we drop our lines and kick back. Now, the thing about my friend is he's a binge drinker, and coupled with the alcohol he drank on board, he was pretty gone. Long story short, he fell overboard. The seas weren't incredibly rough, but for someone in his state, I could see how it would be a bit of an issue to stay above water. Normally, I'd dive right in for my friend, but at the time I was wearing my brand new Yeezys. Just a weird flex I like to do when I have friends around. Now, a lot of you may ask, well, why not just take the shoes off and jump in? Well, I had Gucci socks on. Well, okay, why not take the socks and shoes off and jump in? Well, I was wearing a really nice top and pants and boxers as well. So by the time I would have had to get naked and everything, it would have just been really awkward. But fortunately for him, I had something that would help him out in this situation. I ran into my cabin and came back out with my little Coast Guard boat. It was only a couple feet long, but I figured it would do the job. Plus, the life preserver was about the size of an arm floaty, so at least he could have half of his body bobbing up in there and type of thing, you know? Not fully submersed, so he can kinda breathe at that point. So I decided to check the fuel in my boat and make sure everything's connected. All the while my friend's screaming, something like that. But I keep doing my boat, make sure it's good, because I don't want to ruin my boat. This thing was expensive. I'm talking like a couple grand for a little RC boat. This ain't no toy, kitty kids. You ain't touching this. This is my big boy boat. So I get it in the water and everything, and I turn back around to look for him, and I can't really see him anywhere. My fear is he's drowned and I'm not going to be able to find him, and then I'm just wasting gas in my little boat, and that can get expensive. You know, the fuel in those little boats is really not the cheapest, but it's alright. A friend is worth it, you know what I mean? Fortunately, his head comes above the water, so I was like, cool. Start my boat up, cruise it on out to him, and it's got this button I press and it lets go of the little life raft, because I don't want to get too close to him, because in his panic state he might grab my boat, and that's just a no-go. So I detach it probably 15 feet away. I'd say it was about 15 feet away. I detached the little arm floaty life preserver and cruise my boat back. It even had sirens. I forgot to mention that little siren, so it was type of thing, you know. It was really cool. Lights and all that stuff. So I get my boat back and I'm loading it up, and all the while I've been yelling at my friend to go grab the preserve. It's right there. It's right there. But he doesn't. I don't know why. He might have just been drunk. That's the only thing I could assume. He was drunk, and he just wanted to argue and be stubborn and all that kind of stuff. You know, he's a big old macho guy. I don't need a arm, Blvd. But, he didn't come back up. This was a couple weeks ago. I'm still convinced he's probably holding his breath out there or something, you know, hiding under the water, trying to get the attention he thinks he needs. But I wasn't about to drive my little Coast Guard boat back out there in case he was just trying to mess with me and break it. Because he always gives me a hard time about my flexes. Whether it be my RC boat, my Yeezys, my Gucci socks, even Gucci condoms, you know? Just everything. I guess at this point I digress. Overall, it is something I'm pretty scared of, time to time, thinking about if he's still out there holding his breath or if he really did have an issue. But if he had an issue, there was a arm floaty right next to him, so I guess it's his fault if anything bad happened. End scene. Yeah, I don't know what was up with that story, guys. Yeah, most like them, but that'd be cool to have a little boat like that, you know what I'm saying? That'd be really fun. I'd be cruising that thing with the sirens just wee wee everywhere I'm going, dropping little life preservers like little floaties. Alright everyone, thanks for listening. Hope you have a wonderful day. Yeah. Catch y'all later.